gentlemen, the current trend of increasing internal migration in developing countries greatly harms the population of these countries. In this debate, Team Slovakia will stand by the protection of these people through limiting internal rural-urban migration. We believe that this is the obligation of the state in order to protect these people. We'll show how this harms people in 3 basic points. First of all, those who migrate are usually slum dwellers, and by increasing their life conditions, which is something that this motion will do, we will help them and improve their chances of moving to the middle class. Secondly, we'll help the people living in rural areas who are an integral part of the economy. And then the third argument brought by the second speaker will be about how we help the urban population in general by decreasing crime rates. So, how do we want to enforce this law? Ladies and gentlemen, we want to issue internal passes to urban dwellers after a census, and also to those seeking relocation and their families. This would have to be done in a limited amount, according to how the slums, individual in the cities, are able to integrate new migrants and provide a sustainable environment in which these people can move to the middle class into the city. This would be done randomly, and it would also be done, of course, to the visitors with temporary passes, and only with these passes would people be able to access services, and would they be able to access the city inside. If a person was found without a pass, he would be deported out of the city. So moving on to the first argument of how slums are deteriorating and entrenching people inside of them. Ladies and gentlemen, in this argument I will explain how with increasing migration, the slums and their conditions deteriorate, the chance of moving onward decreases, and of course how our policy will solve this. No thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, migrants regard cities as places where opportunities flourish. They go there, usually move to a slum because of low housing costs, hoping to find a decent job and move to the city. If this worked that way, Team Proposition would have no problem with slums today, ladies and gentlemen, because that means they would fulfill their purpose of being this sort of transitional station in which people in slums can move to the middle class. The problem, however, comes with increasing migration, which is a trend we can see in the world today, ladies and gentlemen. Because of this, no thank you, in the vast majority of the cases, people are not able to move onwards. The UN report predicts that the current 1 billion people living in slums today will have moved to 3 billion in a mere 20 years. And for example, the growth rate in the city of Manila is only 1%, while it is more than 10% in 2 of the slums around the city. Yes?
If these slums are so terrible, why don't people just move back to the rural areas?
Well, the problem, first of all, the problem is that they continue with their hope of being able to find and of being able to move up, because yes, this is what can happen, but it happens in a few cases, and everyone thinks that he is the lucky one who will be able to. And second of all, these people usually sell their own farmland that they have left in the rural areas, and so they cannot return because they don't have anything to return to. So ladies and gentlemen, what are the negative consequences that come with overpopulation? Well, the first one is density in the slums. Ladies and gentlemen, in the slums of Bangladesh, for example, according to UNICEF, it is 200 times the national figure, the density. This causes problems regarding infrastructure and amenities, which are insufficient, of course, but also, most importantly, the health of the people, ladies and gentlemen. Because they don't have enough place, these people have no place to put waste away and to use the toilet. And because of that, a study found that 40% of the wells used in Kenya as a main source of water are contaminated with fecal matter, ladies and gentlemen. We care about the health of these people because they don't know what they're moving into. We want to stop them from doing so. No, thank you, sir. But the main problem, the main negative consequence of this is the entrenchment in slums, ladies and gentlemen. Because when there are a lot of people in this place, and the number is continuing, the job creation in the cities, which themselves don't rise that quickly, cannot provide enough job opportunities, ladies and gentlemen. And because of that, a lot of people compete for a limited amount of jobs. And therefore, to be able to get a job, people have to be willing to work for a low salary, often in very informal positions. This pushes the price of labor, no thank you, down and expands the gap in earnings between the city center and the slums. In the Kibera slum in Nairobi, for example, the rent of a shack in the slum is as much money as cost of 1 glass of orange juice in the city center, ladies and gentlemen. People moving there are in such a different condition than in the center that it is impossible for them to move on. By limiting this, of course, we are firstly and most obviously simply decreasing the flow of migrants, which makes the density smaller and which gives these people a better chance of moving. But also, ladies and gentlemen, we are making government investment programs more effective. These development programs that are already in practice are not able to keep up with the growing expand of people and therefore are not effective because, no thank you, by the time 10 apartment buildings for these poor people are built, 20 more are needed. So by limiting rural-urban migration, we're not only improving the quality of life in the slums of the people, but we're also giving time to the authorities to alleviate poverty and so help the migrants, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to the second argument of how rural-urban migration damages the sustainability of rural production. Rural areas that are depopulated by this internal migration are especially important for the self-sustainability and supply of agricultural production in these countries and are often the cornerstone of the economy of developing countries. With more and more people moving from the countryside to the city, less and less food producers, the farmers, have to feed more and more food buyers, the people in urban areas. Yes?
Well, when we see that this country is on a transitional stage of the manufacturing sector, isn't it natural that you're going to have more jobs appearing in those sectors? And that keeping people in the rural areas is depriving them of economic possibilities.
Yes, the point here is that, yes, these rural areas are underdeveloped and people may want to move, but this migration even worsens the problem because when people move from these areas, governments that in the past did not have enough money to invest into these rural areas because they invested it into the industrialization of the cities. They did not have enough money to do that. But now that they are industrialized, they have more money that they should be able to put into the investment of rural areas where people live. The problem, however, is that when people move from the rural areas, they lose motivation to do so because there's a decreasing electorate of people living in rural areas. Therefore, an even worse condition for life, which again reinforces migration into the city and also harms this rural production. Another thing, and that is also an answer to the point brought out a few seconds ago, was the fact that with less people in rural areas, ladies and gentlemen, there's a smaller amount of food supply, and so countries change from being exporters to importers. And this is something that the International Center for Sustainable Development has seen, and it manifests itself in the rise of food costs, which first of all are bad for the people in the slums because again these people don't have a lot of money and they have to pay for food that is extremely expensive. But also what it does not do, what some of you might say, it does not help the farmers. It does not give them more money because the extra profit is divided between the proxies, between the buyer and the producer. So because continuous migration into cities decreases government motivation to help the people in rural areas who are important for the economy of these countries, who want to have a good life just like the people in urban areas, we believe this is a policy that must be enshrined, ladies and gentlemen. So what have I told you? First of all, how slums are deteriorating because more and more people are coming there. This causes a great overcrowdedness of the people and entrenchment inside of the slums. And secondly, that even for the people who live in the rural areas, it is better to stay there and motivate the government to help them. Thank you for your attention.
What we see today from the proposition side is a system that segregates the people based on where they are born. It damages the nation on a social level. But more than that, it does not even work. But the problems it creates as a result damage the people at an economic level and hurt the rights of the nation as a whole. So ultimately what we see is that the proposition argues for a mechanism that will only further damage the nation and not allow it to develop as it should. And that's exactly what I'm going to prove today as the first opposition speaker. Now in my speech, I'm going to go over the proposition's case and show exactly why their mechanism is completely unfeasible and the damages that would cause, and followed by criticizing their arguments, and after that I'll go over on the opposition side. But let's start with the mechanism that was provided. Now they talk about things such as the internal passes for people, but ultimately we see that all this is doing is creating a system of just because you are born in a city, now you are allowed to have the access to the benefits of the city. Despite the fact that others are born outside rural areas, they cannot gain these accesses based on where they live. They create a lottery for the benefits just based on life. And ultimately, this is no way for a nation to survive. And even if we were to assume this could work, this was even some kind of feasible, the way they punish people who stay in the city despite not having a pass is that of deportation. Now, today in the world, we see people risking life and limb, crossing from countries to get risk a better opportunity at life. And somehow deportation is going to stop people from moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. We see absolutely no solvency for how these creation of these limits would actually prevent people from moving into these cities. No, thank you, sir. All we see is that once they're deported out, they will try again, as happens already with even worse risks. So ultimately, limits don't even prevent the damages they so claim. And even if these limits were to stop the people, they don't create benefits, they damage the people, which is exactly why their first and second arguments do not fit in this debate. Starting with our first, slum dwellers. Now they come up here criticizing urban living. They say that these places are not great. No, they are not great, but they are better than the rural areas that these people are coming from, and that's exactly why we see the people staying there. They say it's because they sell their farms. No, ladies and gentlemen, they do not sell their farms. Their families stay in their farms. No, thank you, sir. Usually what we see is that it is the men and the grown children who move to the urban areas to be able to send money back to their families in the rural areas and provide for them. So there is a way to move back, but they don't, because they are moving for an opportunity to seek a better life, something that the proposition is denying them. And we even see this with their second argument, sustainability. They claim that increased migration damages these nations, but this is empirically not true. We see nations such as Brazil, who are in the biggest economic boom in recent years in their country, and despite the fact they have huge urbanization rates in cities such as Sao Paulo and Brasilia. And why is this? Because they manage their urbanization properly, and it's because they're able to succinctly form a way that people can move to the cities, seeking an opportunity at a better life, while helping everyone. And instead, what the proposition does is it limits this opportunity, which not only hurts those moving, it hurts everyone there. Yes?
The opportunity of which you are talking is close to zero, really. The opportunity is only a fantasy.
Thank you, sir. But in the fact, it's not. And that provides me a perfect transition to the opposition case, because that's exactly what it is about. That the proposition is going to try to diminish the idea that this opportunity is nothing. But that is a fallacy, because we can see that those who live in rural areas, their quality of life is next to nothing. And what does the proposition mechanism do to fix this? Nothing. They limit people out of the cities and then leave them there to starve. No, thank you. So ultimately what we see is their mechanism does nothing for the people, and the opposition stands firmly against that, starting with how we would actually solve the problem. But ultimately, the problem is not urbanization. In fact, urbanization is the solution. When you do things such as proper urban planning, which would be the ways to provide infrastructure and defending the rights of some of the most neglected sectors of society, when we build these cities in proper manners, we can help defend everyone and urbanize these cities in a way that defends people. In fact, the United Nations is already creating awards for countries like India, Bahrain, and Mexico who do this today in efforts to help this. And ultimately, what we see is that when we create urbanization, there are many benefits. And now what the opposition case is all about. The first opposition argument will be that of economic violence and second-class citizens. The second opposition argument will be that of the pursuit of opportunities. And finally, the third argument will be that of benefits of urbanization. It will be argued by my teammate, Nick Farazine. But starting with the first argument, economic violence and second-class citizens. Human rights are a priority. Nothing comes before them. And especially in a developing nation where they're starting to grow, they have to establish these. So when they finally become a developed nation, these things are being held into account. And under the propositions mechanism, this does not occur. Why? Because we see examples such as Article 23 in the Declaration of Human Rights, where everyone has the right to just and favorable conditions of work. But what happens? We see that most rural work is poorly rewarded. For example, farming in much of Africa, no thank you, madam, rarely generates more than $750 per worker a year. And then, when you include all of the costs, it leaves them nothing to escape dollar-a-day poverty. And the proposition wishes to entrench them in that living now and forever. What else do we see? We see the right to education. And where we see that for people who live in urban areas who generate much more money, for them it is easy to gain education. But those who live in rural areas, they have to traverse long distances. We see that they end up having to pay more money, and ultimately the proposition once again denies them the right to education. No, thank you, sir. And finally, Article 25, the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. What do we see? We see that child mortality rates are incrementally higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas. No, thank you. This is because the development is in the urban areas, and when you allow people to move it, they can access those benefits. But when you stop them, when you limit their movement, you are preventing them from accessing education, health benefits, and all these other things, and thus you are limiting their rights as people, which is exactly why you cannot stop their pursuit of better opportunities, which is the second argument. They say that there is no benefits, but we see that 84% of the population without access to an improved source of drinking water lives in rural areas because all the development and all the infrastructure is in the urban areas. We see that there are people like internationally displaced persons who are IDPs who ultimately have to escape from these situations, whether it's due to war, whether it's due to famine, drought, other things that cannot be prevented through basic development. And what happens? They are limited to their own places, to these places where all these problems occur based on where they are born. So ultimately, what do we see from the proposition side? We see they limit their pursuits to a better life. We see that they limit their rights to life. And under the opposition, we provide solutions short-term through remittances and long-term through the development. And that's exactly why, when taking these rural and urban people into account, it is the opposition that holds them in high regards and saves them.
What we see is that cities are of opportunity. That is why generally people throughout the ages have moved towards the cities where opportunities such as education and employment flourish. However, what we see is that already many of the cities in developing countries do not fulfill this role. This is because they have gotten overcrowded and they do not fulfill for the basic human rights that were so thrown on us from the side of opposition. And we are very sorry to see that opposition have used populistic phrases rather than real statistics to claim that this situation in urban areas is so much worse than on the countryside. So this is what is going to be primarily my role in this debate. I'm firstly going to show why there is in fact only an illusion of opportunity and why this is only getting worse. Then I will show you why in fact many of the urban slums are already much worse off than the rural areas and why the trend is deteriorating. And then finally I will show you why our case at this point still stands. So let's start with the opportunity. Now what we believe is that this is just an illusion. We have shown in our first speech how the mechanism works. There is only so much work and so much opportunities in the cities that are available. And because of many people view these cities as that it is easily to attain this education and this work, for example, they move there. However, what they do not realize is that the situation is much worse. For example, Manta, has already told you that population and density in slums in Bangladesh is 2 times higher than in rural areas. And the conditions such as malnutrition in these areas is much worse. It's 55% for the slums and 1% in India. We also see that, for example, the mortality rate in the slums in Nairobi is circa 50% higher in slum areas than it is in the countryside. What this goes to show is that people only view these areas as an opportunity. They come there and then, because they are forced to work for low wage, they get entrenched in the vicious circle of poverty. We have told you that in the worst slums in the world, in Kibera, the glass of orange juice in the city center costs as much as the monthly rent in the slums. What does this mean? That even if the person would try to save money for his whole life, he would probably, not be able to move out of this situation and to pay for education or to, move to the middle class. So we believe that this is an illusion. But we do not think that the cities should take away this opportunity from people. Rather than we believe that the government knows better how much of the jobs are available in these cities and then can control effectively these migration. So what we believe is that because the decision of an individual may be rational, but in the aggregate demand they are getting worse off. That some of the people may reach the highs, but most of them end up in great lows. We need to do action. We believe that because state has the role and duty to its citizens, it should do so. Also, they have tried to really point out some inconsistency in our model by telling us that, well, we are doing the random system, but this is the closest of what is real in the world that you are
That point, sir.
No, thank you. That you said that you can be born in the countryside, you can be born in cities. So by randomness, we are able to allocate these few places that we know. No, thank you. That the people will sustain themselves in the city is the best model. We believe that solves it. Also, we see that all around the world, migration control works. So we do not see this as a problem. Yes, sir.
Just understand this, you believe that the rights to education, standards of living, and equal job opportunities are random.
Sir, let me explain one thing. For example, in Guatemala, 54% of children living in slums were enrolled in primary education, compared with 73% in non-suburban areas and 61% in rural areas. In Nigeria and Brazil, these numbers are similar. What we see is that you are deceiving us without even telling us some real facts and statistics. We're showing you that the situation, the situation in urban and rural areas is similar, and in urban areas it is deteriorating. We have shown it that by 2030, 80% of the world's developing countries' population, about 4 billion of people, are going to live in these slums, and this is unsustainable. No, thank you. So by this point, I believe that I have not only defended our case, and it still stands, that the government has the right and the duty to look at this migration, because the people in the cities are better. I have also shown you why, basically, their case does not stand, because they're just throwing at us some human rights that we are much more, that we are actually better off and more able to protect in restraining this migration to a lower pace. No, thank you, because the cities cannot sustain it. They already cannot sustain it. And now I would like to move also to refer to the case, to the point that was never reacted to, and how this basically destroys the rural areas. You have never reacted to why governments, how governments are now seeing rural areas as less important, and how this essentially results in this. No, thank you. These rural areas deteriorating even more, and these conditions to be even worse, and then people migrating and willing to migrate even more. What does this mean? That the country's production of agriculture is much lower. Why is this wrong, ladies and gentlemen? The prices on the food market, 2005, a barrel of wheat cost $3. 2009, it cost $10.50. These people in some areas, poor people, their income, no, thank you, the majority of their income goes for food. We believe that this is crucial to understand, that these price fluctuation of food affect these people like nothing else, and you want to take the sustainability of these countries from them. We believe that this is crucially wrong. No, thank you. Now let me move on to our split argument, which is crucially important, because it also refers to why the overcrowdedness of the cities affects the rest of the urban population, mainly throughout the increasing crime rates. And we believe there are the two most frequent forms of crime that result as the result of growing slums and the prevalent migration. And these are the petty crimes, gang violence. According to UN Habitat, city dwellers we generally suffer from more crime than rural inhabitants. No, thank you. And the cities with highest murder rates in the developing countries are those which also have high slum rates. But we believe that this is, no, thank you. We believe that this is also mechanism that is similar to what really encourages the migration in the first place. That these people come into the cities with a vision of easily obtaining all their higher living standards, that these people want and think they are able to achieve education and employment, but they are not. They are therefore entering the gangs, which not only provide them with this material goods that they want, the money, but also reaffirm their social status. Well, we believe that the social norms are not prevalent in these areas, and therefore the drug cartels, for example, in South America, in favelas, are able to flourish, and the governments are not able to control them. This is the South America you were talking about. This is the South America that is severely affected by this crime. Also, there is religious diversity and cultural diversity that results in clashes in cultural classes, such as we may have seen in 1992 when Hindu-Muslim violence arose in India after the demolition of massive Babri mosques, and afterwards, for months, there was violence. We believe that our model, by limiting population that can migrate to the cities, solves all the problems, and we believe that then the opportunity opportunity will not only be an illusion, then it will be real. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I begin my speech, I would like to point out two very important things of the last speeches. The first was the idea that somehow people who abandon rural areas are abandoning their farmlands and selling them. This sort of distorted view that somehow everyone who lives in a rural area owns farms and are simply rice pickers or working in coffee collection and are the actual low workers that do not have these privileges is the one that is being reflected in the proposition's idea of the lack of comparison when we look at rural and the urban areas. And the second one was a criticism that was drawn that simply evicting people out of these cities would do absolutely nothing because they would try again and again and again. And since they do this in international cases, when we see that inside a known nation where cities barely have delimited borders, in which it's almost impossible to surround an entire city and avoid people from going in, and random checks to make sure that people have these passes would be impossible to sustain, and the burden would be immense. When we see that even so, it would be almost impossible for them to be able to enforce this mechanism, that itself, please, no thank you, that itself is a concession of their capacity to fulfill their burdens in this debate. But apart from that, we can see that even if they could accomplish this, it's not something that we would want. And this is where I will move on to the case of the proposition before presenting the third and last point of the opposition, which is that of the benefits of urbanization. So let's begin. First, we see this idea of the slums, and we must first stop here and take into consideration that the only criticisms that can be made of slums are when they are put in comparison with the rural areas. And although some of these points have been brought up, we can see that when taking a closer analysis at the actual cases of these rural areas, they fall short. For example, the points of education were brought up without taking into consideration that most of the children are actually left behind in these rural areas, and that's why you're going to see a difference in the rate of these people getting education in the urban ones. But remittances are sent back by the capable parents, usually the father, that are sending this money back and developing the infrastructure in these rural areas. They also never answered the idea that the jobs themselves, no thank you sir, are shifting from this agricultural sector to the manufacturing sector. When we look at the statistic that UNICEF says that the actual change from these of migrating children that are born in the rural areas versus in the urban areas might increase their survival chance, considering the statistics that UNICEF has gathered, we can see that clearly there's a misunderstanding on this illusion. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is not an illusion. The reason that people go and stay isn't because they've sold their farmlands that they never had to begin with. The reason that they stay there is because it is better. Because the infrastructure that exists in these urban areas that is naturally developed there because of the industrialization of these countries and the investment of the state, no thank you sir, are the ones that they're able to leverage. Whereas in these rural areas, because rural areas are so dispersed, they're not centralized, and the resources used there do not yield effective results and do not yield the same impact in urban ones, they do not have this infrastructure. Even if you're able to, I'll take it in a second, madam, even if you're able to provide a high level of enrollment, you will never provide the same level of education. And that is the critical flaws, and they're being overlooked by Team Slovakia. Yes?
Well, despite the fact that we've already said that some of the, for example, education rates are higher in rural areas, don't you realize that the main point of the second argument was that they are getting worse in rural areas when people move out of them?
I understand your point, and I'm going to move into your second argument for a moment, but bear with me. And you're saying that they have a higher enrollment rate, but once again, we do not see this translate into higher education levels. And this is the problem with the resource management that the proposition is talking about. They also talk about this point in their second, in which they say that you're not dealing with the rural areas. And we can see that there's two ways to deal with the rural areas, the short run and the long run. And the opposition deals with both, while the proposition only deals with one. The proposition in the long run says that they will provide this investment by keeping people in these rural areas and attempting to force the hand of the government by putting money there. The thing that happens is that the opposition believes that in the short run, by allowing people to migrate into the urban areas, you allow money to flow through the method of remittances back to the rural areas. No, thank you, sir. In that we can see that these people are capable of providing for themselves thanks to this migration. And they're actually dependent on this, and taking this away will worsen the situation of these rural areas. Sir, further we can see, no thank you, sir. Further we can see that if we look at this case in the long run, by moving labor according to demands of the market, in which these jobs are actually shifting from the agricultural to the manufacturing sector, we create a higher development rate in the country, which will ultimately benefit the government and its tax revenue and benefit the people overall, which will generate development in these rural areas. So thank you, sir, because they will be allowed, because there will be development in there as well. So you can see that both the short term and the long run are dealt with on the side of Team Mexico, whereas on the side of the proposition, they neglect the short run and tell people they must suffer now so that they can benefit from this later. Let's move on to this sort of last third point, which they talk about crime rates. And no, thank you, sir. And this is where we would want to stress out the idea that you would forcibly evict people from their homes, where you're going to sweep in and grab people and throw them away. These ideas of social division and the civil unrest that they talk about is exactly what they're enforcing. And that crime would rise doesn't mean that you can substitute crime with state violence and state oppression that denies people their basic rights of their pursuit of a better life. And this sort of segregation, this sort of inhumane treatment of the citizens of their own country is what Team Mexico cannot tolerate. And that is how I move into the third point of the opposition, that of the benefits of organization. So there's multiple stages of development, and I will be dealing with three of them right now. The first is that of the traditional society. The second is that of the transitional stage. And the third one, and this is the critical one in which these countries find themselves in, is the takeoff. Why is it called the takeoff? Because through this industrialization process, these countries are having a shift from the agricultural jobs to the jobs in the manufacturing sector. And that's why we see this migration. The point here is that this isn't some sort of a natural problem that must be dealt with, but it's a natural process that every country that has reached high stages of development has gone through in one way or another. We're simply perceiving it as a problem now, simply because this industrialization rate is much faster in developing nations today. Yes, go ahead.
And this is exactly why we will provide these chances to the people, so that the influx of migrants can keep up
Thank
with
you,
the
sir.
growth.
That's also a great point. They assume that perfectly the government can somehow know exactly how many people need to be where and how many people need to be working there. We can see in the hukou system in China that didn't work. And we actually had a fall in productivity in the cities where China limited the amount of population that could be in there. And in fact, they had empty houses and they had a higher demand for jobs than they could account for. So we can see that ultimately this is a form of economic violence, not only to the individual, but to the state as well. This takes me to the case of Lagos in Nigeria, where we can see that the study shows that there's a higher employment rate for these people who would migrate into Lagos than they would otherwise have in the rural area, which reinforces once again that these people wouldn't have jobs in the rural areas. The reason is that with a lot of industrialization, you now have tractors, you now have other technologies that are substituting these workers, and they can only find their jobs in a manufacturing sector. By denying them this, you are not only denying the country development, but you're denying them their rights and their opportunity to pursue more. Further, there's a case of Bolivia that has a decentralization law, and we can see that in Bolivia, they have to spend about the same per capita as you would in any area of the country. But the yields and the impacts are always in their urban areas. Why? They already have established a high level of governmental and private infrastructure that they can leverage, and hence they always provide more than anywhere else. So we can see that by concentrating the population and concentrating resources in urban areas, we provide more education, more healthcare, more of everything, because it's simply cheaper to do so, and ultimately benefits the individual as well as the country in general. And this is the most important in developing nations who have scarce resources and can't afford to simply subsidize and send money to those rural areas to the people who need it the most, because they need them into urban areas. And by legislating such a limit that for starters wouldn't even work, but if it did, you wouldn't only be denying them their rights, you would be denying the actual economic development of the country that could take them out of their misery. And for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, it is clear why we must oppose this. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it would be completely insane to deny that progress can be achieved through urbanization. However, that is what Team Slovakia never did in their speech, and I will now show you in 4 substantive points why Team Slovakia has so far done a better job in this debate, and why the team of opposition hasn't been able to fully respond to the claims and to the arguments of Team Slovakia. So first of all, I will look at the conditions of slum dwellers, and I will actually put a dynamic perspective on the conditions and show you why continuing influx of migrants is in fact worsening the conditions, and how these conditions are very bad even in today's time. Then I will talk about food security. Then I will talk about the development of rural areas, and I will show you why this is a crucial point, and how Team Slovakia in the proposition is solving problems with the countryside, while Team Mexico in the opposition are simply ignoring it. Then third of all, I will talk about violence and how crime is perpetuated by poverty, and why our measure that is alleviating poverty is helping in this area. And the fourth point will be about urbanization and what is the best and the most effective way to urbanize a country. If it is by natural process, or if the government should have a say in how much urbanization is the good value. So first of all, let's look at the slum conditions. The slum conditions, as we have already been telling you throughout this debate, are appalling. They are appalling not only in comparison with the city areas, but also in comparison with the rural areas. If we can see that in Kenya, the overall child mortality rate, sadly, is 112 dead babies for 1,000 births, we can also see that in slums of Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, this rate is even higher. The team of opposition never reacted fully to this extent of how these conditions, these sanitary and health conditions in the slum areas are deteriorating, no thank you, and are in fact worse than in rural areas. And now let's look at the clash about opportunities, and in which I will talk, in which I will show you why the opportunities that are existing in slums are getting, no thank you, worse, and how basically the slums are unable to contract that large number of migrants. And this is very easily done. In slums, most people are employed in informal positions. The most people there really, for example, look for scrap metal. They might, for example, work as a rickshaw driver. They might work in many different areas where the price elasticity of labor is very high. And that means that when more people from the countryside come to the slum and they compete for these jobs, no thank you, they are pushing the price of labor down. And what happens is, because these countries cannot enforce minimum wage laws, and especially they can't do so in informal sector, this means that there is a great gap between the conditions in slum areas and the conditions of, no thank you, the middle class, which means, and that this gap is also getting wider. So this means it is progressively harder for people to actually achieve something. The urban poor are getting poorer each year with the influx of new migrants. No thank you. This is also exacerbated by the problems that are created in the countryside by rural-urban migration. Because we can see that for developing countries, it is especially important to be self-sufficient in food production. This is something that the countries need to achieve. Why? Because, I'll take you in a second, most poor people spend most of their expenditures, of their monthly expenditures on food, and therefore if there are any fluctuations on the market and on the price, they are the ones who will feel it the worst. Don't you agree, sir?
No, I don't. But the fact is, considering people already risk so much breaking migration laws, what makes you think risking deportation would somehow solve all these problems, even if they were somehow to be true?
Thank you. Actually, we can show you an example where that has worked. We can show you that, according to the University College of London, the government of Egypt was successful in consolidating the situation in slums of Cairo precisely by the strategy that we are using. Also, I want to say that, of course, no system is bulletproof, but this system is effective in at least some, to a great extent, limiting rural-urban migration, and that is what we believe matters. Now, this food security of which I was talking, is therefore damaged, and that means that countries have to rely on imports of food rather than on producing their own food, and especially when there is great commodity. No, thank you. When there is great commodity dependency, such as is the case of wheat, any fluctuation in the market, which can be very high, then damages the poor people most. So now, to move on to my point about, no thank you, about violence. We believe that violence is principally caused by poverty, and we believe that we are managing to alleviate poverty. No thank you, because we are, in fact, allocating the resources of the country in the best possible way. Now we are doing this by limiting the amount of urbanization to a level that is both efficient for the country and sustainable for the country. This then leads me to the fourth point about urbanization and how we believe that urbanization is indeed a great thing. However, let's look at what the team of opposition told us in this debate. They would want us to believe that the only way a society can progress to a modern industrialized economy is by having to undergo this state of social dismal in slums, such as it happened during the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Now, what we believe is that these countries now have the capacity and the ability to learn from the mistakes of the past by using appropriate public policy, and in doing so, they are, first of all, making sure that the amount of people who go into the cities is guaranteed to at least a certain extent of getting opportunity to flourish, and at the same time, they are helping the governments to help to keep up, sort of, with the upgrading of living conditions, because they do not need to plan for uncertain variables in urban planning, for the uncertain variables of rural-urban migration. So for all these reasons, I believe you should vote for the proposition. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the third speaker of Mexico, it is my duty to present an impact analysis on the arguments presented so far in this debate. And in order to do so, I will present two main questions. The first one is, do limits work? And the second one, even if they did, what would be the impact of this implementation? But before going into that, let's just clarify what this debate is about. So we believe on Team Mexico that this debate is about the quality of life. And thereby, we need to evaluate this debate on how we uphold the best possible model in which we uphold with human rights, because that is the only way that we can evaluate that there is quality of life or not. On their side, they simply do not care about the quality of life. They simply do not care about human rights in the sense that they believe that these are something random, that the fact that you're born into a rural area will determine the basic rights that you will have. And the problem with that is that then you create segregation. And as they're so worried about the violence and the poverty, they're definitely going to condemn these people from their situation due to the lottery of birth, because we believe that therefore, the fact that you're born in the rural area will determine your economic situation. And that is something that Team Mexico doesn't stand. And we'll prove to you why it's a unique harm to their side. So having said that, I will move on to the first question of this debate. Do limits even work? So they talked about this model in which they're going to give a random pass to everyone in the nation, and therefore limit the amount of population in each city. But the biggest problem with that is that this is not as simple as they are portraying. In the end, in this country, you do not have any borders whatsoever. So it is definitely going to be difficult for a government to control the influx of people coming in and coming out of the cities. And simply a pass is something that is not going to determine whether or not the limits are achieved. At the same time, you also have migrant workers, which they will be continuously going on and moving from the city to cities as they have to work in this country. And the problem with that is that they are not dealing with the problem of the overflowing of the system. So they're criticizing the fact that quality of life is being affected when even their own system has gaps, as they allow migrant workers to continue going into these cities and continue using the system, and therefore the public services that they are advocating for and the public services that they say are going to be affected are not going to be solved because the migrant workers will still go and use them. And in the end, we clearly have a problem with the model because it is simply not going to work. At the same time, they even considered that yes, we might have some cases in which people still go into the cities and infringe upon the law. And the fact is that at that point they are considering the fact that their mechanism is not solvent at all. And in the end, they cannot be claiming, no thank you, they cannot be claiming all the benefits that they are doing if they do not have any of these solvency yet. At the same time, we criticize that and portray the example of the Google system in China, the only country that has implemented this sort of internal migration. We see, thank you. And we see that it was definitely a problem because it decreased productivity. So it was detrimental for the development of this country. And at the same time, it imposed a classist view upon their nation, which divided the nation and caused even more segregation and poverty, which is one of the reasons why we shouldn't advocate for this system. So having said that, I will move on to the second question, and also in which I will analyze all the arguments that were presented by both teams. So their first argument talked about the slums and how it is simply impossible to move onwards into the middle class when you have these problems in the public services. They gave us the examples of Manila and Bangladesh, but the problem is that they're not accepting the fact that we presented to you the situation of the rural areas, in the sense that these rural areas suffer from natural disasters, which is something that they haven't answered in this thinking. And the problem of natural disasters is the fact that Bangladesh and Manila suffer from continuous floods. And the problem is that these people need to move out from the cities. And the problem is that you're condemning them to stay there just because they have to stay there, just because of the quality of life of the people in these cities. And the problem with that is that you're infringing upon their right to movement. You're infringing upon the right to actually save their own lives. And the problem is that the only thing that you're caring is about the quality of life of the people in some cities, when you're overlooking the quality of life of everyone in the country. And at that point, we see that your side does not hold quality of life in the sense of human rights, because you simply are infringing upon their opportunity to pursue a better life, to pursue the public services that the government has to do. So the government has already failed them once by not providing with the provision of these services. And now they are punishing these poor people for something that is a mistake of the government. So we clearly see that there is a problem with their model, which is definitely going to condemn the people who are born into rural areas. So having said that, I will move on to their second argument. But before that, yes.
Are you aware of the fact that the government is failing to provide public services mainly due to the fact that they have to concentrate more and more on
the problem is that
urban
you haven't considered our model. We presented to you a model of city planning in which we believe that the technical and political process concerned with the use of land would actually be the solution for this. And we presented to you an example in Bolivia, in which when we concentrate the population, it is more cost effective to provide with services because you have more accumulations of population. So it is definitely easier to provide with improvements in the infrastructure, whereas on the rural sector, on your model, you have to completely build another new hospital, another new electrical system in order to provide with these public services. So there is a clear difference between our models, and we can see that on our side we are more cost effective and the better allocation of resources resides on our side. And even more when we're talking about developing countries, where they have limited resources, we have to accept that these countries have to go for the best possible model, which is clearly the one that we're proposing. So having said that, I will return to their argument, that of the rural, the damages to the sustainability of this country. So they talked about how developing countries depend on agriculture and how there are going to be problems because we're simply not caring about the rural area. And the problem is that they have overlooked our solution, which comes in two levels, the short term and the long term. In the short term level, we have remittances. And remittances work. Thank you. Remittances work in the sense that as these rural workers are able to go to the cities to obtain money, they send this money back to their families so that they continue improving their quality of life and improving the infrastructure that they have back there. And at the same time, we provide with a solution for the long term. Because as we explained in our third argument, that of the benefits of urbanization, this is a natural process in which we see that all the jobs are moving to the cities. And the impact of this is that these jobs in the cities develop more technology that later will reach the rural sector. But the difference in this, and even if you consider the time frame argument in the sense that it is going to take time to have development, on our side we do not have the harm of infringing upon the right to move from to these cities. So actually we're not infringing on the opportunity of them pursuing happiness, on them pursuing a better life. On their side, that's a unique harm that they have, and therefore they are not upholding the quality of life, the criteria of this debate. So having said that, I will move on to our side of the floor, which we consider on our first one, that of the economic violence. So you're going to violate the example of rights that we presented to you, that of just and favorable conditions to work, that of education, that of the standard of living. And they haven't answered this because they simply cannot compare the quality of life of the rural areas to that of these slums. Because when we have that in 2004, more than 3 out of every 5 rural people, approximately over 2 billion, did not have access to a basic sanitation, we believe that there is definitely proof that the quality of life in the rural areas is much worse than that of these slums. At the same time, we have that the urban sanitation coverage was the double of the coverage in the rural areas. So we believe that it is definitely better to have this allocation of resources in the urban sector when you only need to extend the infrastructure and improve it, whereas on the rural sector you have to completely build a new